that ensued after 1492. So people can make arguments. In Philadelphia, there has been a move to pull the likeness of former mayor and previous to that, police chief Frank Rizzo, because of widespread allegations of brutality on the part of his police department towards minorities. So again and again, we have names that have given offense. In Boston, and I'm probably going to mispronounce this, there is a place called the Newell Hall, maybe you guys would know.
Faneuil Hall.
Yeah, which is named for a fellow who, and by the way, this hall is considered, sometimes referred to as the cradle of democracy, because it's associated with the early efforts of the Patriot cause in America to go off the British control of North America. And people want to rename that hall. And here's another, this is a kicker, it struck me as somehow ironic. We have a place in New Jersey called Stockton University. And its namesake is Richard Stockton. And they have removed the bust of Richard Stockton because he was also associated with the slave trade. So you see, the issue goes beyond just Confederate statues of Robert E. Lee or others. And it's certainly worthy of our consideration. I think we all believe in free speech, forms of free expression, but obviously in our country, battle lines are forming around the issue of flags and statues and busts and other icons that give offense to some, all right? So we have a very, by the way, my name again is Rob Hayes. I'm the coordinator of journalism, media, and professional writing. We've pulled together a very distinguished panel of 5 professors, 4 in history, 1 in the social sciences, psychology, sociology. Our participants from left are Brian Ahmed, Earl Page, Gina Turner, got your name in the right place, Saul Levy, and Mike McGovern. So what we'll do, folks, because I don't think we've gone over sort of how to, we're going to fly here, is I'll give you each about 4 or 5 minutes, or as much as you want, just to your opening statement about your feelings about this whole issue. And I'll throw out one specific question that you can react to. Does the educational value of these symbols outweigh the historical record and the possibility that that record gives offense to some people in America? It's a balancing act here. Mike, why don't we start with you?
Okay, thank you, Rob. Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for coming. I'll get to your question, but I do want to say maybe as a prefatory remark that, in my view, if the Lincoln/Johnson administration had had the courage to do the right thing and hanged Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis in 1865 or 1866, we probably wouldn't be having this conversation today. So I think there is some context here, and I think the other issue for me, in thinking about this, and my observations at this point are more impressionistic than a full-blown thesis statement. The Civil War and its aftermath is a very complex, multifaceted, complicated set of issues with a couple things at their heart, racism and slavery at their heart. But I haven't seen or read much of that complexity in what I've heard about the current controversy. In terms of removing the statues and the flags and the symbols and the monuments, my view is sort of nuanced. I would separate, maybe it's a false distinction, maybe somebody else wants to jump in on this, but I think there's a distinction between the flag and the statuary and the memorials. Robert E. Lee himself, the much maligned Robert E. Lee, was pretty clear that the flags should be put away at the conclusion of the hostilities. The last of the Confederate armies surrendered 150 years ago this past spring. And Lee wanted those flags put away. Lee also resisted the call by his own, quote, government to conduct a guerrilla war, an ongoing guerrilla war against the United States government. Flag is a claim of sovereignty. We plant the flag, we lift the flag. So I don't have much time for anybody that wants to sport a Confederate flag. I think those things, and frankly, Rob, I think, the flag issue was raised during that murderous assault in Charleston by Dylan Roof, that racist young man, I guess that was about a year ago, a year or so ago. So I think that's what started it. The statuary and the monuments, I think most of them should come down. Maybe one of the most notorious that's been in the news lately, not, over and above the one in Virginia, is the one in Memphis, Tennessee, honoring Nathan Bedford Forrest. It is an equestrian statue at the center of the Health Sciences Park in Memphis. It was erected during the time that there was a tremendous reaction against civil rights progress following the First World War. It is a bronze statue, but in years gone by, it was fitted with gold leaf. And I happened to be in Memphis one time when they were re-leafing it, reapplying the gold leaf at a cost of $700,000 to the taxpayers of Memphis. Now, Nathan Bedford Forrest was a very talented cavalry commander during the Civil War, but prior to the war, he was also a notorious slave trader. He was a slave owner. His exploits during the war included executing black troops at Fort Pillow, Tennessee in 1864 who had surrendered to Confederate forces. And if that's not all bad enough, he was one of the co-founders of the Ku Klux Klan in Pulaski, Tennessee in 1867. So I think there's very little reason to keep it up, and frankly, I think a whole lot of reasons that it should have come down. And I think that's largely true with a lot of that statuary, which was put up at a time as a symbol of intimidation and racial victory over African Americans in the South. However, there are some, and I'm going to cite the one in Durham, North Carolina, that was torn down by a mob in the aftermath of the Charlottesville incident. Looked that up afterwards because I thought I saw some inscriptions on that troubled me. And it was a memorial put up to the dead Confederate veterans of Durham County. I think it was put up in 1924. Yep, 1924, paid for by county dollars. And it was a memorial to those who had served in the Confederate forces from Durham County. A couple things troubled me about that, not the least of which was that it was taken down by a mob. A little bit disturbed by that incident, and I'm not entirely sure that all of the memorials to all of the veterans who served in the Civil War should be torn down. Most of them should. And I don't know, I probably never did get around to answering your question, did I?
No, that's a pretty good intro.
So that's where I am this morning.
All right. Well, I will try to answer the question as it was put there. I think you did as well. And, but I want to approach it in a little different way. Take this as a learning opportunity. Right? How do we decide matters like this? Why, in fact, are we even having this conversation? I teach American history, and those of you who've taken American history courses, you know that we study a lot of wars in American history. I think from the student's perspective, it's like the biggest challenge on the history exam is to remember all the wars. And so it's not just the Civil War. So the question is, why is this particular war so important to us? Why are there more monuments and more books written about this war than any other war? Right? I mean, why do we have more monuments about those who fought the American Revolution? Why aren't there more monuments about those who fought in World War II, which posed a more existential threat to the existence of not only America, but the free world? We don't have as many monuments about them, do we? Right? And we're not having a conversation about whether we should have statues. We're having a conversation about the Civil War. And we've been having this conversation for 150 years. Right? So in itself, it tells a lot about who we are, as much as about any of the people we're talking about who lived then. It's about us. And it's always been about us. And that's why this war is the most difficult war for America to come to terms with. Because in this war, we're not fighting the Japanese, we're not fighting the Germans, we're not fighting Russians, we're fighting each other. And we're still, in some ways, fighting each other. And the war reminds us of this ongoing battle in American life. So what I would say is, don't really listen to me in my opinion about whether they should come up or come down, because that's one person's opinion, everybody's entitled to their opinion. What I'm asking students to do, and an educated citizenry to do is rather to ask yourselves, how should we make this decision? This is my opinion, her opinion, but how should we make this decision? And what we try to teach students to do is through clear and honest understanding of the facts, right? Laying out the process by which you reach a conclusion. Thorough examination of the evidence, right? And in this, we're not lost. I mean, there's a mountain of evidence. Anyone who even cares to look at it, and it's so easy to access now with the internet. You just Google, you know, as opposed to going into archives and dusty books and documents, you know. So thorough examination of the evidence and consideration of motives, prejudices, and biases that most people have and expressed in different ways. So you look at what is this person's motive, what is that person's motive, what is their bias, what is that other person's bias, right? And then, should we judge people from the past? I've heard it said, well, you know, we can't really judge people from the 19th century by 21st century moral standards, right? And what I would say to that is, we always judge people of the past. That we judge people of the past, and future generations will most certainly judge us. And whether it's 100 years from now, 50 years from now, 20, people will look back, and that is why what we do is important. Our generation did not erect these statues, but history will record that we either let them remain, or we had the moral courage and conviction to take them down. But history will judge us one way or the other. And then, about the question that you asked, educational value versus historical value, I don't necessarily see them as oppositional. But to that, I would say, you know, people did important things in the past, and should we honor that? Should we respect that? There, I would say the present belongs to the living. Right? This is your only time on earth. This is your time. Right? Other people were here. Other people were here before this country was founded. Other people will come after us. This is your time. And so therefore, the people that we put on pedestals should reflect who we are. Right? And every generation gets to choose their own heroes. You get to choose your own role models. And the people you choose reflect your values, your commitments, and your beliefs. And so as you take a look, if some of the people that past generations chose are also your choice, right? And then you may choose to keep them. If other people chose other leaders for different criteria with different belief systems and different values, and they no longer fit our society of who we are, then we should look around and see if there are people who do, or people from the past who did, that maybe other generations didn't respect and admire, but then we look back at them and we find them to be extremely courageous, and people who are unsung and not noticed in history, and then we'll give them a chance to be appreciated now. So when we go through that process, I think, then, you know, we will ultimately reach the correct decisions. But the statues are unique in that they are places of honor. The people we put on pedestals represent people we admire. Now, museums and history classrooms, those are places of education. So to say, well, we can put them there or keep them on pedestal, and that's just educating, right? No, the public square is where we put up the people we want to admire. If you want to learn about people, good and bad, in an in-depth way, then that's the place, I think, for classrooms and possibly museums. But places of honor, the people we put on pedestals, are people we admire.
All right, thank you. So thank you, Professor Hayes, for inviting me, even though I'm not a historian, to be here. But I am a psychologist, and so when I was thinking, my name's Gina Turner, and when I was thinking about this and doing some reading before I got here, I got to thinking about what psychology is, which is the study of human beings and their thoughts and their feelings and their behaviors. And one thing we're really interested in answering as psychologists is, how do we become the people that we are, right? And a huge part of that has to do with the stories that we tell ourselves, about our communities, about every aspect of the culture that we live in, right? Whether that be the neighborhood you live in, the country you live in, the activities you associate yourself with. Those are all stories that you choose to tell yourselves. So that was what I was thinking about when I was thinking about this idea of the memorialization of different figures associated with the history of this country. And I really appreciated with what Dr. McGovern said about something I had read, which is that many of these statues were put up kind of as a backlash to the results of the Civil War, and kind of this bubbling up of people who, you know, who were fighting against Reconstruction and fighting against providing rights to the people that had been disenfranchised. So they were telling a story by memorializing these people who, as they've described really well, far better than I could, who have these particular histories, right, involved in the slave trade. So again, as a psychologist, history is a collection of facts, but the way we tell ourselves our history is a crafting of a narrative, is a crafting of a story, right? And just the same way as I could tell you the story of my drive home and how I had a great drive home because I was listening to an interesting podcast, or I could tell you about the terrible drive home that I had because I saw a truck on fire, right? Those are facts about my drive home, but I can frame that story in two very different ways. So we can frame the story of the Civil War in two very different ways, and I appreciate what Professor Levy was saying about how we want to portray ourselves to other people who follow us, right? How do we want people to understand the story that we're telling of ourselves? And so I just want to read this little snippet of an article that was published in the Chronicle of Higher Education just about a week or so ago. And it's talking about the city of New Orleans, and basically the snippet is pretty self-explanatory. So it's in the context of the community of Charlottesville taking down this, Confederate relics, and it asks, how should citizens and scholars remember and memorialize the slave system that those rebels fought to preserve? New Orleans exemplifies that dilemma. The city's mayor, Mitch Landrieu, won national attention in May for a speech that dismantled the bogus Civil War history enshrined in Confederate monuments. But in defending his city's removal of those statues, Landrieu also demanded that New Orleans reckon with their city's history of bondage. New Orleans was one of America's largest slave markets, a port where hundreds of thousands of souls were bought, sold, and shipped up the Mississippi River to lives of forced labor, of misery, of rape, and of torture, he said. The lack of monuments to that past amounted to historical malfeasance, a lie by omission. So he's really talking about which story do you tell and how do you craft that story?
I'm kind of not man out here. I'm a European historian and a sociologist, and there's a whole bunch of things swirling around in my head based on what's been said to this point. For example, from a non-American perspective, which is probably going to get me bats and criticism from my fellows here, very few countries on earth teach as prostituted a version of their own history as we do. We are always couched in these moral terms. This is the city on the hill, and that's crap. All that stuff that you learn and unfortunately remember about George Washington never telling a lie, and Paul Revere making that heroic ride, all those little stories color the narrative in situations like this. Secondly, I see this statuary memorial flag thing, and I thought Mike's discrimination between flags and statuary is very important. But I see it as part almost of a larger current issue, and that is political correctness. In this country right now, our public debate is almost paralyzed in some respects by ideas about what is and is not. For example, there is an activist group on the University of Colorado campus right now saying that veterans should not be allowed to attend college. They should be limited to trade schools because they bring the cult of militarism to a college campus, a campus of snowflakes, that should not be exposed to potential dangers of militarism. Where do you draw the line? Do we now tear down the Arc de Triomphe because it represents French military victories over the rest of Europe, and some German may be offended? Why don't the French have to give back all the art in the Louvre to the people they stole it from as part of military conquest? This is a slippery slope about what you do in reaction to the past. Another thing, I teach deviant behavior. One of the problems is defining what deviance is, okay? And when you do this historically, it's incredibly difficult because do we have the right to impose our moral judgments and our ideas on people who lived 200 years ago? That's very, very difficult because do you hold cultures and people to absolute standards of what is and is not acceptable behavior? Or do you introduce the relativistic argument which says what is and is not correct? Doesn't it change over time and change rather quickly in some ways? For example, I sometimes say this in class. How many of you have tattoos? Come on, put your hands up. 100 years ago, how many of you would have had tattoos? Not unless you were a pirate, a criminal, or drunk in the military. Tattoos, okay? So if standards change so quickly, it makes redefining how we consider the past even more difficult. Because if we're going to be judged by some future generation about what we chose to preserve or tear down, and historians revise the past all the time, okay? I teach medieval history. You've all heard of Henry VIII. Toward the end of his reign, he seemed rather crazy, okay? Now they are looking at the evidence of the trauma associated with concussions. You all know what I'm talking about? It's a hot issue in sports and injuries, right? Henry VIII jousted. He didn't have a foam-filled, air-filled helmet. When he fell 6 feet off a horse with his considerable bulk and slapped the ground, was his brain damaged? Could his erratic behavior as a 40-year-old king be tied to all the thousands of falls he had in jousting? So we're all constantly, historians are constantly revising how we consider the past and what is laudatory, what is praiseworthy, what should be sustained. But statues, I've asked my classes in the past couple weeks. There's a monument in the middle of Allentown. There's a monument in Middle Easton. People who have seen those monuments hundreds of times have no idea what's on them. You know there's a Confederate soldier on the monument in Easton? Because the monument was built in an attempt to reunify and talk about all the common sacrifices that were made. Okay? So do you just chip him off the statue? This is an incredible, as Mike said, and it's an incredibly complex, layered issue. The fact that we are now so sensitive that people are actually talking about me going to a Mexican restaurant being guilty of cultural misappropriation. Okay, because I have no right there. I'm not Mexican. I'm not Latino. I'm a dumb Irish Mick. I got no right eating Italian food, okay? Eating Mexican food, that's cultural misappropriation. I mean, where do those lines get drawn and when does that stop? And it flies in the face of one of the ideal paragonic virtues of theoretical America. Are we not inclusive and tolerant and all those things? Yet, one of the things that troubles me, and probably everybody up here, is that the people opposed to these monuments and memorials are in some ways being just as intolerant and irrational and unreasonable as the people who want them maintained. And there has to be a coming together, a place of real dialogue. And to this point, I hear a lot of shouting and a lot of recrimination, but not much willingness to actually talk. And it's characteristic of our Congress, it's characteristic of our governments now. And the mayor of New Orleans, that speech is a very powerful speech. I would invite you to Google it. And he makes a lot of excellent points about coming together and separating wheat from chaff in terms of statuary and memorials. But again, I'm a European historian. I don't know anything about this. So, you know, as the Romans said, cum grano salis, with a grain of salt.
Can you flash your tattoo again? Can you flash your tattoo
Picture
again?
of the tattoo.
Your tattoo?
It's my son's name, not Chinese for I like soup.
No tattoos on me. Not yet, not yet. I guess I haven't, not, well,
Here.
it's coming. It's coming next time. Yeah, it's, we have a complex history in our country, a very complex history with a lot of elements in it that occurred in different times under different value systems that troubled some people even back then, but were the majority value at the time. And our thoughts have changed over time about these. And it's a constant process. When we began the conversation, Rob was mentioning the statue of Richard Stockton over in South Jersey, slave trader, obviously. I was thinking about the many Columbus statues around the country. There's many, many Columbus statues. And of course, his reputation's fluctuated downwards amongst many people in recent years. I think actually a statue of a guy named Commander John Mason up in Connecticut, who led a very violent attack back in 1637 of Puritan settlers against Pequot Indians, involving burning a Pequot village and killing everyone who came out. And he had this large statue erected to him on the spot of the battle in Connecticut, 1898, that was looked at askance more recently and moved, not taken down, but moved from the battle scene to his home, just to make it a little bit less provocative to the remaining Indians up there. So we have a lot of monuments in the country that can be seen as difficult and certainly reflecting values that aren't our values. Civil War monuments are more numerous and more involved in public discussion now. And I was thinking about, like, why are they all there? And it's got quite interesting history of the bulk of these monuments. Warned in 1865, I think, as Mike McGovern mentioned, a decision was made back then at the end of the war by President Lincoln, that the conclusion would not be an ending of punishment and retribution. Rather, it would be a time of reconciliation and coming together. So Lincoln really sought to prevent harsh retribution against Confederate leaders or Confederate soldiers on the theory that the country should reunite in brotherhood. And as Reconstruction continued and ultimately failed to change Southern society very much, a whole spate of violence involving the Klan and other militia groups, a new idea swept the country that sort of took Lincoln's idea and took it a step further, idea of national reconciliation. Can we not really come together as a people, white Northerners and really the white Southerners, and put the turmoil of the early 1860s behind us? And in that spirit, the idea of respecting the other gained higher currency. And a parallel idea began to arise in the South around that time. The conception of what's called the lost cause, or as I say, the lost cause idea. And that is the idea that the Confederate rebellion was a noble enterprise by Southern people defending their rights as sovereign states against an overbearing federal bureaucracy. They lost, that's why it's a lost cause, but it was a noble cause. And that feeling arose in the 1870s and the 1890s and resulted in the creation of a number of organizations in the South. And one of the most prominent ones is called the United Daughters of the Confederacy. And that's a group made up of widows and female relatives of Confederate soldiers and leaders. Became a very prominent women's group in the South. And they felt that their duty to memorialize the lost cause by sponsoring the building of many, many memorials to the Confederate dead throughout the South. And that began to really take speed around the 1890s and continued up until the 1910s and 1920s. So the bulk of Confederate monuments in the South, the really bulk of them, were built around the turn of the 20th century, mostly sponsored by this group, which raised funds and cooperated with local towns and local counties to put statues up in public places. And some of them are leaders like Lee, like Jackson, Stonewall Jackson. Some of them are just monuments to the common Confederate soldier, the nameless Confederate soldier. And it had a specific educational purpose in doing that. UDC had a very strong lost cause view of the Civil War. And the purpose of the statues was to teach the rising generation the nobility of the cause that their fathers and uncles fought in. So they should never forget the bravery of these men and the purity of their cause. Along with that went a big push to modify Southern textbooks. So kids in Southern schools would learn the lost cause theory, which is that this was a noble fight about states' rights and had little to do with slavery. And another co-message was that actually the pre-Civil War South was a pretty noble place where the Southern blacks as slaves were treated well by the whites and had a certain bond of friendship. The Civil War upset that and caused a time of turmoil and sort of looking backwards to that era when Southern states lived in sovereign peace and slaves and masters got along quite well before the Yankees began interfering. And that kind of was the ethos of the South, Southern states, up until really the 1960s. That was the message taught in schools and the silent message of the statues. And the UDC actually spread their campaign beyond the South. And you'll find Confederate statues now in western states like Montana. There's a big one there. There was one in Baltimore, which was not a Confederate state until recently. That was removed. So it began to be sort of a national campaign. The most prominent one, some of you may have seen, is Stone Mountain, Georgia, which is outside of Atlanta. A massive bas relief of Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee, and Stonewall Jackson riding on their horses into eternity. Huge sculpture, which took about 60 years to complete. In any case, that's the initial purpose of most of these monuments. Now, I think over time, as the decades have gone by, another sort of thrust has come in. For those who even notice them anymore, and I think the remark by Professor Page was exactly right, few people even notice statues as they drive by them. They really don't pay attention to what's on there. But for those who do, I suspect, and I've seen evidence, that in recent decades it's become less about the ideology of the lost cause for most Southerners, and more about just the bravery of the Southern fighting man. And many families in the South, the older time families, have the history, they have the muster books of their relatives, they have pictures of their Confederate ancestors. And the statues are a tie for them into a family history of battlefield bravery in what to them seems maybe not so much as a purely noble cause now, but at least a cause in which their men fought bravely against overwhelming numbers, as they put it. And I expect that's the current situation. Our thinking about the war and the nobility and purity of the war has changed, because that was a very revisionist view. I should probably get back to the idea of revisionist history. The UDC and the Lost Cause movement was revising history. And those who've worked with Civil War history know quite well that the cause, the right, the state's right that the seceding states were defending, the particular right they were defending, was the right to hold slavery. They felt that the slave system was essential to their economies and their way of life and their social system. They felt it was threatened by Lincoln's election and seceded to prevent any possible future interference with slavery, or actually to promote, in their wildest dreams, the expansion of slavery into other future states in the Caribbean and Latin America. So they were hoping for a future of slave-based economy, and the Civil War was really fought over protecting that sort of system. And that was kind of scrubbed out by this later interpretation that slavery was really a secondary issue, almost an unimportant issue, that political states' rights was the key. So that was an initial revision. In terms of what is to be done, one of the most famous phrases in history was issued by Vladimir Lenin in a pamphlet issue called "What is to be done?" What is to be done today? In that, as a historian and as someone who studies politics as well, one of the key slogans of any political system is that politics is the art of the possible. The art of the possible. These thousands of, over 1,000 Confederate statues are located in towns big and small, Richmond, Virginia, Dallas, Texas, right down to little hamlets like Eatontown, Georgia. They all have their statues. And they're all put there and maintained by either county governments or local municipal governments. The decision to remove the statues in New Orleans and Charlottesville, Virginia, were made by local governments who felt morally obliged to remove these monuments to armed rebellion and the protection of slavery. They felt that they had a moral obligation to do that, and in doing so, I think from my perspective, made the right decision, a very noble decision to do that, a very brave decision. I strongly doubt, seeing politics as the art of the possible, that hundreds of other southern cities and towns and counties are going to make similar decisions. There is no way to force them to do that. I don't know that a national campaign to do that would in any way be successful, and probably would promote greater resistance in the South. And I suspect that a persistent campaign to do so would simply not succeed. So what I think, in my sort of side pocket view of a proper thing to do, would be to add to these monuments. I think Richmond, Virginia did a very correct thing about 20 years ago. They have a prominent avenue called Monument Boulevard. I think it's called Monument Boulevard, which is lined with Confederate statues. It's a very, very beautiful part of town, very broad boulevard with statues of Confederate generals. Put up in the 1920s during a very white supremacist phase of Virginia history. They recently added to that, I guess it was about 15 years ago, a large statue of local prominent black tennis player Arthur Ashe, as sort of an addition of a part of the population that was being ignored by these Confederate statues, and sort of adding that to the mix. I've seen proposals to possibly add monuments to black Civil War veterans who fought. They were from the South, but fought for the Union Army. I've seen proposals to add large statues of Abraham Lincoln to some of these southern landscapes to remind the country this was, in fact, a war to preserve national unity. So from my point of view, the statues were erected in a time when prominent southern leaders involved with the UDC were trying to protect the image of the Lost Cause, and in fact trying to project a message of white supremacy. This is the 1910s, 1920s, 1890s, 1920s. And we've gone beyond that, I think. I think our era would be would do well by adding monuments that reflect our current values for a more complete landscape.
I think, Brian, too, in addition to what you're talking about in Richmond, I think it's Richmond. I've heard over the last several weeks that they're considering statues of Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison,
Yes.
and, get this, Nat Turner. That there would be a statue of Nat Turner who led a massive, maybe the most famous slave rebellion in American
Right.
history in 1831. Can I add one more comment onto what my colleague said too? With regard to that way forward, where do we go? I think the Richmond idea is a good one. But I was perusing an article in the Chronicle of Higher Ed last week by a sociologist at Berkeley. It has to do with the statues, but as a preface to that, he talked about the restoration of a historic classic theater in Birmingham, Alabama. And a theater that hosted during the great era of vaudeville some of the biggest acts in the country, including the Marx Brothers and many others who have gone on to prominence. But of course, in Birmingham, Alabama, it was a segregated theater with a colored entrance, prominent sign outside, colored entrance. African American were permitted to attend the performances, but they had to use that entrance, sit in the balcony, and the balcony contained only benches instead of seats. So now when they're restoring the theater, what they're going to do is leave it exactly the same way. Okay? They're going to restore it the way it was, the colored entrance, the sign. The sign will still be there, the benches will still be there, so that everyone who attends the theater, and obviously everyone is welcome now, to attend performances in exactly the same way and have an opportunity to buy tickets, but everyone will have to confront the past. Okay, everyone coming to that theater will have to see the past exactly as it was, so that these sentiments of things like the lost cause, okay, can be filtered out in Birmingham. That's another way forward, I think, in addition to the complimentary with an E statuary that might be put up in some of these southern towns.
Here's the problem with that.
Not my idea, it's Birmingham's.
But if you keep both statuary up, right?
Yeah.
Is then you allow a myth to continue, right? That we are allowing the lost cause myth, and that's what it is. When you say lost cause, this is constructing an alternative reality, right? We know what the Civil War was about and why it was fought. This is not up for opinion. Everybody's entitled to their opinion, their attitudes. But that's why I said at the outset, let's start with facts and evidence, right? And then we can draw this. So now if at some point you come up with an alternative reality and we allow that reality to stand and say, well, we're gonna put something next to it, right? So this was, I will bring a little evidence. I'm gonna be very brief with it. But each of the Confederate states, when they seceded, just as when we broke away from Great Britain, Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence stating our reasons for why we separated from Great Britain. All of the Confederate states stated their reasons for why they were separating from the United States. And one of them, I just brought in Georgia's Declaration of Separation from the United States, and what they said is, the people of Georgia, having dissolved their political connection with the government of the United States of America, present to their Confederates and the world the causes which have led to the separation. For the last 10 years, we have had numerous and serious causes of complaint against our non-slaveholding Confederate states with reference to the subject of African slavery. You can't get clearer than that. You can't be more explicit than that. They didn't try to hide it. They were out and loud and proud. And they said, we are leaving America because of slavery. And when you read all of them, you'll be amazed how often they say it. How Virginia refers not only to itself, but refers to the Confederacy as the slave states. The slave states. This is how they define themselves, right? Now, I think George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, also from Virginia, would have been offended by calling Virginia a slave state. I mean, during the colonial period, to say, yes, we have slaves, we are slave owners, but that doesn't define who we are. By the antebellum period, slavery had come to define white people of the South. Right? Pennsylvania was a slave state.
It was Massachusetts.
New York, Massachusetts, but we don't think of ourselves as like slave states. It's something we had, it's something we did, maybe something we're ashamed of, but it didn't define who we are. For the South, this was a defining moment. And the myth-making continues to the present, right? So when you mention the Confederate flag, what people often think of, just would be factual, what people often think of the Confederate flag is in fact the battle flag of the Army of Northern Virginia. This is the army that Robert E. Lee actually led, right? The armies of the South, led by Joseph Johnston, they had their own flag. Each Confederate state had their own flag, and there was something actually called the Confederate flag, which started to be very confusing at the first battle, major battle, Civil War, Battle of Manassas. The Confederate flag looked very much like the United States flag. That is, it was stars and bars like this. The main difference was it had a circle, I think 11 or 13 stars, either 11 Confederate states or the 13 original, you know. The problem was in actual battle situations, that it was hard to tell the difference. I mean, unless you could like count the stars on the flag to know whether you should open fire on that unit or not. So you had a lot of friendly fire situations. But there is something called the Confederate flag. That is not it. People flying that on their Jeeps or, you know, putting it on the flag of Georgia or the flag of South Carolina when they didn't even fly that flag during the Civil War. They reached back into history, selected a symbol, endowed it with new meaning, and erected it. And what it meant to people in the 1960s as opposed to what it meant to people in the 1860s was a defiant opposition to civil rights, right? It was the state's way of holding up a middle finger and saying, we resist and oppose equality in this country. And we resist and oppose civil rights to black people. And so therefore when people say, well, let's let that middle finger stand, and like next to it we'll put some flowers, you know, or we'll put like some other message of unity, people holding hands, and we'll have both conflicting messages at the same time, right? So I think, as I said, this is your generation. You have a right to your symbols, to your heroes, and so you say, well, okay, that may have been what people in the past have done. We decide we don't want these symbols. We want something that represents who we are. And so then you make a decision to take it down. And then if future generations want to put them back up or put up something else, then they'll do that. But I think you can't evade responsibility, right, for what stands in your community in your lifetime.
Panelists, you've really given us quite a sweep of history and a lot of insights, and we do want to open this up to questions, but let's connect the dots between the historical record and the comments you've made about our history and to the present. Why is our country even having this discussion now in 2017? Why has it reached such a boiling point? Brian?
Well, I think what happened, it was kind of ignored for quite a long time. You know, I've traveled in the South for a number of times, and statues are all over the place. They kind of were really not paid attention to. I think the massacre in Charleston, South Carolina, by Dylan Roof, and I think the direct link there was there's a troubled and fanatical young man, very militantly white supremacist, you know, militantly, murderously racist, who was celebrating Confederate symbols in his posts and his personal life, not just Confederate flags, but the flag of Rhodesia, which was a Southern African country based on segregation also. So he was flaunting, really digging deep in these symbols, and I think there was a feeling that there was a sense of legitimacy being given to feelings like his by having these statues and flags so prominent. So that's, I think, an urge began to spread to many people in the South more directly that this celebration shouldn't continue. You know, that these monuments should be confronted and ideally, and I'll say once again, ideally, taken down or removed. There's a difference between the real and the attainable and the ideal. But the ideal being sought was to remove these monuments because of, you know, the feeling that they were giving legitimacy to racists, not just as extreme as Mr. Roof, but others throughout the South who might act in that way. That's the immediate impetus. I mean, I can recall a TV series back in the 70s. Most of the people in the room weren't alive then, called The Dukes of Hazzard, about a couple of good old Southern guys racing around the county, breaking the law and making the local sheriff mad. And they had a car, orange car called General Lee, with a big Confederate flag on the top of it, with the Southern Cross flag, the Southern battle flag. And I don't recall any objections to that at the time from hardly anyone. A few activists may have commented, but hardly anyone even noticed that. But in recent times, I think there's been more attention paid to the fact that that kind of symbolism can be seen as legitimizing, in our time, racist and possibly violent impulses that would legitimize this, subjugation of non-white people, especially in the South. I mean, it's quite, as Professor Levy said, the South was not, Confederacy was not try to hide its motives. There's a famous quote by the Vice President Alexander Stephens. I'll give you a quick partial quote. The national government was built on an edifice of racial equality, as he put it, an edifice built on sin that has collapsed. The Confederacy is built on exactly the opposite principle, he said, that the Negro race is quite naturally, I'm paraphrasing here, the subordinate race to the white race and must remain in subjection. That is the natural order of things. So the Confederacy was very clear about the motives, In our time.
But that was
I actually want to respond to that, and because I think you've led into something that I wanted to bring
I
up
do too.
earlier. So, but
Mike had his hand first, and then Gina will go right to
Okay.
you. Okay, thanks.
I'll gladly yield after just a moment. I think in response to your question, I think, if I can give us a pat on the back, I think the histories that are being written today are a lot better than they were, and a lot more accurate than they were in those days too. I mean, I can remember when I was studying history as a graduate student, they were still using people like U.B. Phillips from the University of North Carolina. Now Phillips, for those, you guys don't know who he was, but he was probably the foremost authority on Southern plantation life. Okay, he was also a Southern racist.
Along with Frank Owsley as well.
Yeah, so, when he was writing the history of the South, I mean, this kind of Sambo caricature and all that Dr. Allnutt was talking about earlier, that's the way that history was studied. In addition, the admission to Southern universities was whites only for the most part.
You had to put your picture on your application.
Yeah, okay.
And the principal reason for that was so they could see your racial background.
Yeah.
You had to post like a passport picture on your
I,
application.
the South today is very different than it was even 30 years ago in terms of the people living there. The people in the South are better educated, people in the South have higher incomes, people in the South have higher expectations, and the histories that students are studying in the universities, I think is a more comprehensive look. I mean, just compare a history text today, an American history text today, with one from 40 years ago. If you can find it, it jumps right off the page.
Gina.
yeah, I was just going to say that in terms of. Oh gosh, now I lost my train of thought because I was so fascinated by what you were saying. That's okay. Well, I will back up and respond to something that Professor Page said. I love Mexican food. It's my favorite food. I'm just going to say that right now. I grew up in Seattle, Washington. There was actually a fairly large Mexican community, well, not fairly large, but on the West Coast. In Seattle, there were a number of Mexican restaurants, and I grew up eating Mexican food. And you made the point of that maybe some people say that it's sort of it's taking over the culture, or it's the what's the word your
Cultural appropriation.
yeah, appropriating. Thank you. I forgot the word. The culture, and I think we can kind of talk about where does it become absurd? Where do we reach the level of absurdity? But I now remember what I was going to say. In talking about leaving up the Confederate monuments but adding additional monuments, or this really fascinating idea in Birmingham of keeping the theater open, but there's still the sign that's labeling the colored entrance, and there are still the benches. I don't want to go to that theater. I don't want to walk in that because. I just simply don't want to go to that theater because I get tired of being constantly reminded. These quotes, they still hit me. I still am emotionally affected. And, we talk about snowflakes and being politically correct, but I think one of the reasons that that Confederate flag on the General Lee in the TV show Dukes of Hazzard, it probably did bother people, but it wasn't okay for people to speak out in a way that it is becoming more and more okay for people to speak out and say, you know what, this actually bothers me. The way that you are appropriating this symbol, it bothers me. The way that you talk about my culture bothers me, right? And so people are now taking the opportunity to say, you know, we haven't had the chance to talk about this, how these stories, how growing up reading the history books the way they were written in the 1960s and 1970s, we haven't had the chance to talk about how that makes us feel, right? Where no one is asking what our experiences were in terms of growing up in a country with significant discrimination. No one has asked us how it feels to grow up in a household where there are two languages spoken, kind of back to this idea of you know, talking about other groups and talking about if you come into the restaurant, you know what I'm thinking, you go into a Mexican-owned restaurant and you're making fun of the words on the menu, right? There are instances where it might be offensive for someone to interact with another culture, right? There are instances that people just are feeling more and more comfortable speaking out and saying, hey, it's time for us to be able to tell our stories. And so back to your question about why is this such a huge talking point in our culture right now, I think Brian makes a really important point that, of course, that was a horrific incident that happened, but also we were in an era where we had our first African-American president, right? And these stories are starting to be told, and as a psychologist, people hate it when your story is you hate to be told you're wrong. Don't you hate it when you find out that you're wrong about something? And you're like, oh God, I hate it. I hate admitting that I misunderstood something, or I hate admitting that, oh wait, I didn't have all the information, right? It's hard for us. It is hard for human beings to take on new information that challenges our pre-existing beliefs. And so we have people who have been able to tell their stories and take it for granted, right? In psychology, we like to say a fish doesn't know it's in water, right? You've been living with your story being the primary story for your entire life, and now suddenly people are telling stories that challenge that story. That doesn't feel good. That's really uncomfortable. And so I think we're seeing a similar backlash now in our country, right? And I think that this played out in the election and the way the election progressed, and in the incidents that are happening now. We're seeing a backlash of people who are very uncomfortable with the standing story that had existed for so many years, being challenged by all of these other voices in our culture.
But again,
Yes.
again, the polarization, when you have a presidential candidate loosely characterized, mostly rural, mostly southern, Midwestern people as a basket of deplorables, how much more polarizing can you get?
That's very polarizing.
And I owned timber, 110 acres of timber in the Shenandoah Valley for many, many, many years. Those people are not deplorable. Some of them would cut their arm off for you. And I was an outsider and a hippie. And they accepted me. So to blanketly characterize a whole group of people as deplorable, for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. And some of the backlash is coming, again, because their stories are threatened and they can self-identify and say, I'm not like that, that's not me. So it's incredibly layered and incredibly complex.
Okay, we're gonna open this up, and Brian, you can get it. I
No
can see you're
questions.
itching.
No, I wanna get
We'll
questions.
take a question here, right back there, yes.
I know you're focusing mainly on the Civil War era, but there've been some recent groups and calling officials who've been calling for the removal of statues and memorials in Jefferson and Washington and other officials from the Revolutionary period. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on those, as they were slave owners.
Yeah, I want to take that one. I was thinking about that quite a bit. The president made some linkages there. Well, first of all, two things. You're right, there are activist groups calling for them to come down. And then in his comments about Charlottesville, President Trump linked this Confederate statues to these other ones. And I think there's a qualitative difference here. We have a lot of slave owners in our American background, a lot of them, and not just Jefferson and Washington, but Ben Franklin, William Penn, Ulysses S. Grant, plus many, many others you wouldn't suspect of being slave owners. So it's a huge number of prominent American slave owners, and I doubt that it is practical or appropriate to think about removing statues of them because of the other things that they did to help shape the country in a positive way. The problem with the Civil War is that we have an armed rebellion against the government to defend slavery, all right, an armed rebellion. The armed rebellion presents issues of its own difficulty. President Andrew Jackson confronted a possibility of secession back in the 1830s from South Carolina, and he wrote a very loud letter to the people of South Carolina in which he laid out a very simple principle. Disunion by armed means is treason. He put treason in large capital letters, okay? So, and Andrew Jackson, as you know, was a Tennessee slave owner. So the principle that armed secession is legal or possible in this country was challenged by Jackson back in the 1830s and pretty much put to rest. So to commemorate folks like Robert E. Lee, who had a choice, was given a choice when the secession began to command the U.S. Army or command the armies of his home state of Virginia, and chose to fight with Virginia against the United States. That's qualitatively different in our history than someone like Thomas Jefferson, who never led an armed rebellion against this country, and in fact helped shape the country.
On the
Yeah.
question of slave owning, right?
Yeah.
This is where we really need students to be able to think critically, right? So for a person to say, well, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, Andrew Jackson, Robert E. Lee, they were all slave owners. This creates a kind of simplicity, right? And if that's all you know about any of these founding fathers, then you might say they're all the same. But there's a lot of complexity and difference between them as slave owners. I'm just going to briefly just take Washington, for example. Washington was a major slave owner, but he seemed to me, as I study him, struggled and was uncomfortable in his slave owner, right? Such that by the end of his life, he freed all of his slaves in his will. Jefferson was the most outspoken critic of slavery, and then he becomes a person whose principles are so different from the way he lives his life, right? So the contrast, right? At the end of their lives, one of Jefferson's last letters to Washington is he's writing to Washington talking about how he's able to now use the children on his plantation in his nail factory, right? And how he's getting letters from other people, his plantation, how they're beating the children on his plantation. And he writes this letter to Washington, about you can make your slaves even more profitable. So when we look at this, they're not all the same. Some were struggled with it, some were embarrassed with it, others made a deal with their conscience, right? Benjamin Franklin briefly owned slaves, but he ended his life as the president of the Pennsylvania Society for the Abolition of Slavery, right? His last letter to Congress before he died was a letter to Congress asking them to abolish slavery. This is when they're coming up with what became the Bill of Rights. He wanted one of those to say there'll be no more slavery, right? So I can't put him in the same category with, someone like Robert E. Lee, who when he invaded Pennsylvania and attacked in Gettysburg, he gave orders to his army to capture any free black people you see in Pennsylvania and bring them back into slavery. So he's not only a slave owner, he's a slave catcher, right? He had a choice. Lincoln offered Robert E. Lee command of the Union Army, right, before he joined the Confederacy. So he had a choice there, and he chose to go that way. Not all Southerners were the same, not all presidents were the same. Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, and Missouri stayed with the Union as Southern states. The southern part of Virginia broke away to form the state of West Virginia, right, to stay in the Union and fight against other Southerners and other slave owners. So people, and someone asked earlier, can we judge people by the past by the morals of the present? People at the time understood the difference between right and wrong, between the treatment of human beings. They had access to the same moral literature we have, whether it's the Bible, Moses, Jesus, Confucius, So they were able to form moral opinions and have values the same way we do today. And so we should judge them according to what they were able of knowing.
Can I respond in this way? I just want to read if you bear with me for a second, I want to read a quote and then you tell me who wrote it. I will say then that I am not nor have ever been in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races. that I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of making voters or jurors of Negroes, nor of qualifying them to hold office, nor to intermarry with white people. And I will say, in addition to this, that is a physical difference between the white and black races, which I believe will forever forbid the two races living together in terms of social and political equality. And inasmuch as they cannot so live while they do remain together, there must be a position of superior and inferior, and I, as much as any other man, am in favor of having the superior position assigned to the white race.
Was it Abraham Lincoln?
Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah.
Okay? That was 1858. 6 years later, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation. 7 years later, he was urging the admission of, or the end of slavery in the constitutional amendment, had invited African Americans to join forces, the armed forces of the United States, okay? So, things change.
People able to change and grow, and so we have to grapple with that complexity and judge each person, you know, on a complex set of criteria, not just simplistically, you own slaves or you didn't, right?
And just really briefly, again, as a psychologist, we don't like complexity. Our brains do not like to have to work very hard. And so to take on, to actually try and listen to all of the nuance and all of the, maybe the pain that is triggering someone saying, we should take down this statue, versus all of the nuance and understanding and pain that's saying, we need to keep this statue up. Right? And to be able to, as you're pointing out, to be able to come and meet in the middle and have the conversation, and for both sides to have the nuance and to be able to remain calm enough to be able to hear each other's sides, is something that it's very, very hard for people to do.
You know, in addition to, you're gonna hear this conversation on college campuses this semester, in addition to the conversation we're having today. You know, Yale University, founded by Elijah Yale, a slave trader. Brown University, founded and endowed by the Brown family on slave trading money. That one's really interesting. Well, Georgetown's even more interesting, but Brown University, two branches to that family. One was the slave trading branch. The other branch of the family included John Brown, the abolitionist who tried to end slavery through an armed insurrection of his own. So,
Okay, Kiki, you had a question?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask the same thing. Mike, you kind of like said what I meant to say, that isn't it true that every country, I was born in Greece, and you know, everything that I was taught about my country's history ended up not being what I'm thinking about right now, like who, you know, what happened, who were the good guys, who were the bad guys, who were the enemies, who were the victims, and that as we develop as a society and we move forward, that we look at our history, our country's history, and we re-examine it. And I was just going to say exactly about, you know, the student groups that are demanding in all of the universities, the major universities around the country, to change the names of buildings because they're named after people that are associated with racism, and that in fact you have from Georgetown to Yale to all these, you know, Ivy Leagues, you know, having to address the issue of how the founders of those universities have benefited from the slave trade, and how the schools themselves also benefited from the slave trade. So again, and then you have, on the other side, you have somebody like Ta-Nehisi Coates, who's a well-known African-American journalist, who talks about reparations for slavery. And I mean, we are thankfully in a society where we have the freedom to discuss and debate those issues, because we view history from our own personal perspective, but also as a society. I think it's awesome that we go back and look at, hey, what about the dropping of the H-bomb in Hiroshima, you know, the A-bomb in Hiroshima and Nagasaki? Should we readdress that? Should we readdress, you know, the benefits to American capitalism as a result of slavery? You know, a system that was built on slavery. Should we address the fact that, you know, people go to college and they benefit from an education that slaves, you know, provided the money for that? And I think that's a healthy sign, although the debate with regards to statues and things like that is only a part of us re-examining our history. We've done that with Native Americans as well. And I think, you know, these are the conversations that show that we are an inquisitive and open society, that we're not afraid to look at these, you know, even the darker little corners of our history. So I just want to say that.
We're running out of time. We have about just a few minutes. Another question? Yes, sir.
Yeah, this is for all of you. Do you think that this removal of the statues is basically sugarcoating American history? Like, you can remove the statues, you can remove the flags, you can remove stuff from history books, you can remove that, but history is what it is. You can't really get rid of what happened.
Yeah. Well, I guess I'll answer just quickly. I think that it's problematic if you don't, if the statue is removed without a discussion of why the statue is removed. Kind of back to your point, you know, if there is a discussion, a clear understanding, rather than a mob pulling a statue down, there's a clear understanding of what is the context in which the statue needs to be removed. And then I did read that little snippet from the article earlier, the mayor of New Orleans saying, if we take down the monument, we still need to remember this history in some way. And I think Professor Levy said that's really well, that that the stories, the real stories need to be told. But the history is taught in history books and in museums. Who are we glorifying on these statues? And that's a big question about what statues should remain and what statues perhaps should be taken down.
Christopher, if you look at the battlefield in Gettysburg, you've got a statue of Meade on one over on Cemetery Ridge, and a statue of General Lee on Seminary Ridge, and they're facing each other. Now, if we take Lee down, who is Meade facing?
But also, the idea of lip service, do we currently feel good about ourselves because we take down a few statues when we don't do anything fundamental to change the reality? The worst poverty in the United States is Indian reservations. Talk all you want about, oh, we freed the Native American. No. Put your money where your freaking mouth is. Change the culture. And tearing down monuments won't necessarily do that. Maybe it's a baby step, but you have to do something more than pay lip service to values. You have to do something to see them put into effect. Yeah.
Folks, I think we're just about out of time. So, panelists, thank you very much for a very stimulating.